They stopped him, mocked him, and looked down on him. Two smug officers, oblivious to the fact that behind the calm gaze and sharp suit stood the department's new chief. He endured their taunts in silence, but what happened next would shatter their notions of power and justice. What came after would shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. Mark Grayson, a black man in his early 40s, navigates the quiet evening roads, his mind lingering on the challenges and responsibilities awaiting him. Dressed impeccably in a dark blue business suit with a light blue tie, he reflects on his recent promotion to chief of police, a position he's kept relatively private until now. Although his expression remains calm, Mark is fully aware of how he's perceived in this predominantly white neighborhood. Just another black man in an unfamiliar place, someone who stands out. His quiet thoughts are shattered by a sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The wail of a siren breaks the stillness, and Mark instinctively signals and pulls his car to the side of the road. He keeps his hands visible on the steering wheel, a quiet sigh escaping his lips as he prepares for the encounter ahead. He knows too well the tone these stops can take, especially when appearances alone dictate the mood. As he watches, two white officers exit their patrol car. They walk toward him with a certain rigidity, postures tense and chests slightly puffed, a signal of authority mixed with an all-too-familiar arrogance. Both appear to be in their late 30s, fit and confident in their roles, with the air of officers who see themselves as enforcers rather than protectors. Mark observes them without reaction, his composed demeanor concealing his inner thoughts. The lead officer, Sergeant Dan Mitchell, reaches Mark's window and leans down, glancing briefly at Mark's tailored suit but immediately dismissing it. Without a greeting, he says, "License and registration," his voice carrying a curt edge that makes his contempt almost palpable. There's no recognition, no question of who Mark is, only an assumption of power over a presumed civilian. Standing a few feet back, Officer Brad Jenkins crosses his arms, his eyes narrowed as he watches Mark with barely concealed suspicion. Mark nods and moves carefully, pulling out his license and registration. The silent exchange of glances between Mitchell and Jenkins doesn't go unnoticed. In his mind, Mark knows exactly what's playing out. The suit he's wearing doesn't fit the profile they're used to. To them, he's simply another black man with no business in their jurisdiction. He hands over his documents, keeping his face expressionless, and waits. As Sergeant Mitchell inspects the license, he smirks slightly, as if something about Mark's presence here is amusing to him. Jenkins shifts his stance, still scrutinizing Mark as if expecting him to make a wrong move. Their attitude is unmistakable, the subtle yet pervasive arrogance of men who believe they control the narrative. Mark hands over his license and registration, his expression calm but vigilant. Sergeant Mitchell barely glances at the ID, instead narrowing his eyes and letting out a low chuckle as he sizes Mark up, leaning back slightly as if finding humor in the situation. Without addressing Mark directly, he turns to Jenkins with a smirk. "Kinda dressed up to be driving around here, don't you think?" His tone is casual but laced with the clear implication that Mark doesn't belong. The comment isn't meant to start a conversation. It's a veiled insult, a reminder of who he thinks holds authority in this interaction. Mark feels the sting of the jab, his face remaining composed, though he senses the growing weight of humiliation settling in. Holding back his frustration, he forces himself to stay quiet, giving the officers no reason to escalate. He's been here before. The demeaning remarks, the assumptions, the power games, but knowing doesn't make it any easier. He watches as Mitchell looks back at him, still ignoring the ID in his hand, as if the title of chief, printed next to his name, is invisible. Officer Jenkins, leaning against the side of the car, lets out a short, mocking laugh of his own. "You don't have anything in this car that would surprise us, right?" His tone carries an unspoken accusation, one that's all too familiar and unmistakably racially charged. Mark, in control of his voice, responds calmly. "You're welcome to look if you feel it's necessary." There's a slight edge to his tone, a subtle but intentional assertion of his own authority, though he keeps it measured. Mitchell scoffs at Mark's response, an expression of condescending amusement on his face. "No need for you to get defensive," he says, as if unaware of the loaded nature of his and Jenkins' questioning. He steps back, circling Mark's car in a slow, methodical manner, not because he suspects anything, but as a display of power, a way to reinforce his assumed control over the situation. Mark's car, clean, well-maintained, and modest but professional, doesn't give them any reason for further suspicion. Yet Mitchell continues his performance, muttering to Jenkins loud enough for Mark to hear. "Always interesting when folks show up in places they don't belong, acting all high and mighty," Mitchell says, his voice a mix of disdain and smug superiority. Jenkins snickers in response, their mutual sense of authority over Mark apparent in every word, every look. To them, he's just another man out of place, someone who needs reminding of his role. The weight of their contempt settles heavily on Mark's shoulders, the familiarity of this treatment mixing with a new, raw frustration. He keeps his silence, his hands steady, his face betraying nothing. Inside, though, a sense of resolve builds. He studies their every move, their casual arrogance, and the satisfaction they take in the moment. Mark has been underestimated before, and he's learned that patience can be a powerful tool. So he waits, absorbing each condescending word, every dismissive glance, storing it all for the moment he knows will soon come. Mark, sensing the time is right, leans forward slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. In a voice steady and low, he asks, "You sure you know who you're speaking to?" His question, though simple, is loaded with an authority that cuts through the smugness of the two officers. Sergeant Mitchell, in response, lets out a dismissive laugh, a scoff that echoes his belief in his own dominance. "We're the ones asking the questions here," he retorts, his voice dripping with condescension. He doesn't bother to hide his scorn, as if the very idea of this man questioning his authority is a joke in itself. But then, as his gaze lazily drifts down to the ID he's been holding, a sudden change sweeps across his face. His arrogant smirk falters, his eyes narrowing as he really reads, the name on the card, Chief Mark Grayson. A few seconds tick by in heavy silence as the realization hits him, the weight of his mistake settling in. The blood drains from his face, leaving him visibly pale, his mouth half open as he stumbles to process the truth. Jenkins, sensing the shift in the air, steps forward and peers over Mitchell's shoulder to see the ID for himself. His previous confidence evaporates as he reads the title and name in front of him. The assured posture he'd held just moments before gives way to a tension in his shoulders, a stiffness that wasn't there before. He exchanges a quick, uneasy glance with Mitchell, both of them thrown off balance by the sudden reversal. The arrogant bravado they wore so confidently now appears hollow, their authority cracked and fragile in the face of their new reality. Mark observes their reactions with a quiet satisfaction, his calm expression unchanged. His patience has paid off, the silent endurance through their taunts and humiliations, now manifesting in this powerful moment. He lets the silence linger, a small knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he watches their confidence unravel. The two officers who moments ago had believed themselves in complete control now find themselves staring at the man they've been disrespecting, a man who holds the highest position in their department. Mitchell, recovering slightly from the shock, stammers, struggling to find words that might salvage the situation. "Sir, we didn't mean... It's just... We had no idea." His voice, once full of bravado, now carries a shaky, apologetic tone as he stumbles over his words, each syllable marked with desperation. Jenkins stands beside him, visibly tense, shifting uncomfortably as he realizes the gravity of their actions. Mark says nothing, letting them fumble through their apologies, his steady gaze enough to remind them of the authority he holds, authority they had so thoughtlessly ignored. The dynamic in the air has shifted completely. The two men who had wielded their power over him now find themselves stripped of their confidence, their actions exposed for what they truly were. The realization of their misstep has left both Sergeant Mitchell and Officer Jenkins visibly shaken. They exchange anxious glances, their once confident and cocky demeanors now completely erased. Attempting to salvage what's left of their authority, they mutter apologies, each sounding more uncertain and insincere than the last. but their half-hearted words fall flat, bouncing off the steely resolve in Mark's expression. Mark's face is firm, his jaw set, and his eyes hold an unyielding intensity as he watches the two officers fumble through their apologies. After a beat, he raises a hand, stopping their words in their tracks. The silence that follows is heavy, the weight of it pressing down on them as they stand rigid, waiting for his response. Mark's voice, when he finally speaks, is calm but resolute, carrying the authority of his new role and the weight of his personal experience. "Gentlemen," he begins, his voice measured, "this encounter is not just about you and me. Your words, your actions, they're not isolated incidents. They reflect a deeper issue within this department." His gaze shifts between the two officers, both of whom have gone pale, each fully absorbing the gravity of his words. Sergeant Mitchell, usually a man of few regrets, now stands frozen, his eyes darting between Mark and the ground, unwilling to meet his stare. Jenkins, on the other hand, clenches his hands behind his back, his jaw tight, fully aware of the precarious position he's in. Both men remain silent as Mark continues, outlining the change he intends to bring to their department, changes that start with holding individuals accountable for their actions. "Your behavior today will be formally reported," Mark states, enunciating each word with unmistakable clarity. The words hit Mitchell and Jenkins like a slap. Neither of them dares to interject. They understand that there's no excuse they can offer that will undo the consequences of their actions. The silence stretches, thick with the weight of their realization. Mark's gaze sharpens as he continues. "If officers in this department believe they can act without respect or decency, then that's on me to address." His tone is resolute, the underlying message clear. Their behavior is not only unacceptable, but emblematic of a systemic problem that he, as chief, will no longer tolerate. Mitchell and Jenkins both stare back, the full implications of his words sinking in. Their arrogance has led them into a situation that now threatens their careers. The satisfaction they felt moments earlier, the smug superiority they wielded so easily, has turned into a deep, raw humiliation. They're now facing a man they tried to belittle, a man who holds their futures in his hands. It's a public reckoning, and they know they are powerless in the face of it. For Mark, it's more than just a moment of personal victory. It's an affirmation of the systemic change he's committed to bringing to the force. He stands as a symbol of that shift, and Mitchell and Jenkins are just the first to face the weight of accountability he's ready to enforce. As they stand in silence, Mark's message is clear. The days of unchecked prejudice are over, and he will ensure that change resonates through every rank and file of the department. The following day, Mark Grayson enters the police department with a sense of purpose, his stride steady, and his expression calm but resolute. He's called a department-wide meeting in the main briefing room, a gathering that's rare and, given the circumstances, has drawn considerable attention. Officers fill the room, murmuring in low voices as they speculate about the nature of the meeting. At the front, Mark stands, hands clasped, his gaze steady as he surveys the officers, including Mitchell and Jenkins, who sit at the back with heads lowered, avoiding his eyes. As the room settles, Mark clears his throat, and the silence that follows is absolute. With a steady voice, he begins addressing the incident, recounting the previous day's events without exaggeration or embellishment. His tone is calm, each word chosen carefully, carrying the weight of his authority and the clarity of his vision. There's no anger or judgment in his voice, only a determination to bring transparency and accountability to a department long plagued by unspoken biases and unchecked power dynamics. This department, Mark says, his voice reaching every corner of the room, has a responsibility to uphold the highest standards of justice, fairness, and respect. That responsibility is on each and every one of us. His gaze moves slowly across the faces of the officers, resting momentarily on Mitchell and Jenkins, who look visibly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Yesterday's incident highlights a problem that is larger than any one of us individually. It's a problem embedded in how we view each other, in the assumptions we make, and in the actions we take based on those assumptions. Mark pauses, allowing his words to settle. There's a palpable tension in the room, an unspoken acknowledgement of behaviors that, until now, have gone unchecked. His expression softens slightly as he continues, yet his resolve is unyielding. From this moment on, there will be no tolerance for prejudice or bias of any kind. Every individual who walks through the doors of this department, both officers and civilians, deserves respect. And as chief, I intend to ensure that respect is upheld, consistently and without exception. At his words, a ripple of surprise and approval moves through the ranks. For many, this is a long overdue message, one that speaks directly to the struggles they've quietly observed or experienced. Others, however, shift uncomfortably, realizing that the days of overlooked prejudices are coming to an end. Mitchell and Jenkins sit with pale faces, their posture rigid as they take in the gravity of the moment. Then, with an invitation from Mark, Mitchell and Jenkins rise to their feet. The room falls into an even deeper silence as they stand before their colleagues, their faces drained of color, eyes downcast. In a voice thick with discomfort, Sergeant Mitchell offers a formal apology, his tone lacking its usual bravado. Jenkins follows suit, his voice trembling as he acknowledges the inappropriateness of their actions and the example they failed to set. Their words hang in the air, a raw admission of fault, and a visible shift takes place in the room. Officers who once might have dismissed such actions now feel the weight of the change that Mark has brought. The message is clear. This department is evolving, and behaviors once excused as minor or incidental will no longer be tolerated. As the meeting concludes, Mark's presence stands as a powerful symbol of the reform he's implementing. His commitment to justice and integrity is evident, his willingness to hold even his own officers accountable, underscoring his dedication to creating a force that truly serves and respects the community. Officers leave the room with a renewed understanding of the standards they're now expected to uphold, inspired by Mark's leadership and the courage he's shown in confronting the deeply rooted issues within the department. In the days that follow, the impact of Mark's speech reverberates throughout the department. Policies are reviewed, training sessions on bias and accountability are scheduled, and conversations shift toward respect, fairness, and unity. Mark's influence transforms the culture of the force, setting a standard that inspires other officers to follow his lead, and the department, once tainted by prejudice, becomes a model of justice and integrity. For Mark, the journey has just begun, but he walks forward with the quiet confidence of a leader who knows he's on the path to meaningful change. His resilience, patience, and commitment to justice have turned an incident of humiliation into a powerful turning point, not just for him, but for every officer under his command. The department has entered a new chapter, one defined by accountability, respect, and a promise of justice for all.